In 1987, Vince Coleman stole 109 bases, and in the almost 30 years since, we haven't had another 100-steal season from anybody. In fact, nowadays, the average single-season steals leader has about 50 or 60, which is half of what Coleman did. In 2014, though, Billy Hamilton is going to give us our next best chance at a 100-steal season, and in fantasy baseball leagues, ranking systems are not equipped to deal with this kind of player. You see, the problem with modern-day ranking systems is that they assume that every stolen base is worth the same, so steal number 10, number 50, and number 80 are all equally valuable. I would argue that that is not the case, and that at some point, stolen bases actually begin to lose value with each subsequent steal. Now, if you think about it for a moment, if you have Billy Hamilton on your team, he's probably not the only player stealing bases for you. So do you really need to win by 50 or 80 steals for the entire season? No, you probably don't. You just have to win by enough so that you're number one in a roto league, or in a head-to-head league, you just have to win by enough that you consistently come out on top. You don't have to blow your opponent out of the water by 5 or 6 steals every single week. So, at what point do steals begin to lose value? Or is that not even the case? Do they always have the same amount of value? Running a simulation based on the 2013 fantasy season, I was able to answer this question. What follows is a very novel type of analysis that I haven't seen anywhere else, so please comment below and I'll see if maybe we can try to refine it in the future. Now, beginning with our hypothetical roster, I used a 5 outfielder, 10-team league as our basis team. For this team, we see that they average 106 steals for the season, or in a 26-week season, 4.09 steals per week. Now, how did we come up with this team? The first thing I had to look at was that not all players steal bases, and in fact, 26% of all players who had 300 plate appearances averaged fewer than 2 steals for the whole season. Now, these players on an 11-team league would account for 2.86 players, and that's where we find them at catcher, first, and utility. Now, you might see that utility is 2.64. Where did this come from? That's just because you can't have 86% of a player, so that accounts for the 0.86, and these players only average 1 steal per season. Now, of the remaining players, they actually average 12.7 steals for 570 plate appearances, and I use 570 because that was the average amount of plate appearances per lineup slot for my teams this past season. It was just a pretty good number to go with. Of these players, they average 12.7 with a standard deviation of 12.13 per player. And again, for our entire season, that adds up to 106 for the year and 4.09 per week. Now, we're going to use this standard deviation and this average to run some simulations at different levels of stolen base ability. And that begins here. Now, knowledge of standard deviations is important moving forward. However, I'll try to explain it as simply as possible. For anyone who doesn't really know what standard deviations are, it just accounts for a chance that we see something differing from the norm. So at 1 standard deviation below our average, this is what happens if our team all randomly decides to underachieve. And we see that for this to happen, our entire team would average 4.75 steals for the whole season, or 0.18 per week. Now, I know what you're saying. 4.75 steals for the whole season is absolutely ridiculous, and you're right. That's because this would assume that every single player on our team underachieves for the entire 26-week season. That's just not going to happen. In any given week, you're going to have some players do better and some players do worse, and for the whole season, you're going to have good weeks and bad weeks. But this is important because it allows us to get our worst case scenario for a single week, because in one single 7-day period, we can see this kind of probability happen where everybody underachieves. It's terrible when it happens to you, but it does happen. On the other side, we see if our entire team overachieves by 1 standard deviation for the whole week. This would give us 208 steals for the season, or just under 8 for the week. And then in the very extreme case, we have 2 standard deviations ahead, at which point our team is averaging 309 for the season, or 11.89 for the week. Now, the nice thing about standard deviations is that they come with certain probabilities. So 1 standard deviation below would actually occur at a 0.84 probability. So this tells us that 84% of the time, our team is going to steal at least 0.18 per week. Half the time, our team is going to at least steal the average, 4.09 per week. 16% of the time, they're going to steal at least 7.99 per week. And 5% of the time, they're going to be really good and steal 11.89 per week. Now, it should be noted that this assumes a normal distribution of stolen base data, for which it almost certainly is not. However, by eyeballing these numbers and from having experience in my fantasy leagues over the past few years, these seem to be pretty accurate. I feel like about 16% of the time, my team does in fact steal 8 bases per week, and occasionally 5% of the time, or about two times a year, 1 time a year, my team's really good and steals 12. For my standard league, that seems to be pretty accurate, so this passes the eyeball test at first glance. Now, by graphing this table here, we can come up with a probability curve. And by finding the value of this line here, we can look at any single stolen base total and what the probability is that our team gets at least that many steals. So by eyeballing it, at 7 steals, there's about a 23 or 24% chance that our team gets that total. Now, knowing this is important as we continue on with our simulations. Now, as we revisit our roster, what I wanted to do was say, well, what happened if we had Billy Hamilton on a league average team? And what happened if Billy Hamilton had certain stolen base thresholds achieved throughout the season? So for our first season, we have our average team here, our first hypothetical simulation. And this average team assumes that Billy Hamilton steals an average number of bases, and that gives us a 50.3% chance of winning any given week. If Billy Hamilton was really bad, and for whatever reason he stole no bases, and we kept him in our lineup all year, our team would win 45.5% of the time in a head-to-head league. If Billy Hamilton stole 1 base, that would give us a 45.8% chance. You can see it goes up 0.3. Now, we did this as he goes all the way from 10 to 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, and 100. And each of these gives us a corresponding win percentage, which is the percent chance that our team will win or where our team would finish in terms of roto rank. By taking this and graphing, taking this, we can move on to our next part here, which shows us in a different table our single player and how his performance affected our team's win percentage. Now, by seeing how much this win percentage increases down the chart with each stolen base increase, we can see how much value is added per stolen base. So by looking here, we can see that from going from 1 steal to 10 increased our stolen base percentage by, what was this, 3.5? So for every single steal, he added 0.379% or win percentage. By doing this same analysis all the way down, we can see that at the very bottom, from steals 90 to 100, it only increased our win percentage by 0.325 per steal, which is noticeably less than we see up here. And by looking at all of these values relative to the first, we can see what value this has relative to the first stolen base. Now, the interesting thing is if we can graph this against this, then we can come up with an accurate chart that tells us the relative value of each steal. Now, you might notice that at 50 or 60 steals, where our normal league leader is, there isn't much change, that the 50th steal is worth 99.5% of the first steal, and at the 60th steal is worth 97.9%. Now, this is fine because in modern day ranking systems, they assume that this steal is equal to this steal, or 100% the value. Now, 100% to 99.5 isn't that much of a drop. But when you start to get out here, between stolen bases 60 and 100, you'll see that the 100th steal is only worth 86% of the first. So with Billy Hamilton and his hypothetical 100 steals, they're going to be improperly valued because it would be assuming that this steal is worth as much as the first, but it's not. It's really only worth 86% of the first steal. Now, we can actually do this with every single category, and I've done that. So for runs, this is how it would play out on 2013's data on our hypothetical 10-team league. The 140th run would be worth 90% of the first run. For home runs, all the way up to the 50th homer, it's actually worth more. So each homer has subsequently more value than the last. Now, if you think about this, it explains why power is always so valued in fantasy leagues. However, when you look at end-of-season rankings, it's the steals guys that come up on top. It's because intuitively we know that power is worth more, but because we're valuing each home run the same and we're valuing each stolen base the same, our end-of-season rankings aren't properly reflecting this. For RBIs, we also see a slight increase. And for batting average, it's actually pretty stable all the way across. The lowest we get is 99.1% out at 350. Now let's have a look at our 2013 fantasy baseball rankings. Now these are the rankings for the 2013 season without any kind of adjustment made for diminishing returns. This is just what they were if you used any old standard rating system. I also threw in 2 hypothetical Billy Hamilton lines. One where he has 100 runs, 4 homers, 38 RBIs, 100 steals, and 275 average, and one where he's noticeably worse. Now this is still a very good season because it assumes 75 steals, but from what we saw out of Hamilton in 2013, he could score 80 runs and steal 75 bases if he bats part-time and works almost solely as a pinch runner. This kind of line assumes that he has a full-time job as a center fielder, which is possible with Shin-Soo Choo probably going elsewhere. Now this hypothetical Billy Hamilton line number 1 puts him right here, 4th overall, and the second one has him at 23rd. Now, what do we see if how this would change if we factor in our new diminishing returns analysis that we just talked about? Hamilton's hypothetical number 1 actually drops him down to 5th, so it flip-flops him and Paul Goldschmidt. Hypothetical Hamilton number 2 drops to 24th, flips him with Josh Donaldson. Now, I actually decided to call out a couple extra players too, Mark Trumbo and Pedro Alvarez, each who moved up a couple spots in the rankings. Now, Alvarez and Trumbo are 2 of your premier low batting average, high power, no speed guys. And as you notice, we saw that home runs actually have increasingly more value at each homer. So it stands to reason that guys who specialize in homers would jump up in the rankings. You also might notice that these aren't significant movements. No player really moves more than 1 or 2, and for the most part, they kind of stay in the same order as you look here with Beltre, Freeman, Bruce, Holiday. They kind of flip a little, but for the most part, they're the same. The ratings themselves do change a little bit, though, and I think an interesting one to look at is Chris Davis and Mike Trout, who over here, they have a .66 difference between Trout and Davis, but over here, there's a whole difference of 1. And this is because Davis's power is getting extra value, and Trout's speed is just losing a little bit. Now, they're still both number 2 and 3 in the rankings, but the gap is a little bit larger. And keep in mind, I would still draft Mike Trout over Chris Davis in 2014. This is purely a representation of how 2013 played out. Now, I've termed this new rating CVA. That stands for Category Value Added, just because that seems like what we're talking about. But this is completely up for debate, so if you have a better title, please leave it in the comments section. Now, it's important to note that we don't see anybody who drops significantly. We don't see anybody who rises significantly. But what this does do, even though it doesn't change our rankings noticeably, is gives us a more accurate and better way of valuing players. So even though it's not a completely revolutionary, we're going to jumble the rankings, it is slightly more accurate in my opinion. And this will be the basis going forward for Baseball Professor's new ranking system. So come check us out at baseballprof.com. Our 2014 rankings will be unveiled soon, and they will have this kind of analysis added in. So thank you very much. Please comment below on what you think, because I'm very curious what the readership and the viewership out there believes of this kind of ranking system. And best of luck in 2014.